All right, so now we're going to talk about, I'm sort of going to lay everything out for you as far as Media Composer, how it works, user settings, just sort of a basic overview of sort of the basics of Media Composer. If you already know this stuff, that's totally fine. Feel free to ask more in-depth questions if you don't know those. But as I said before, try to keep it broad and, any specific questions, try to ask me after class. So we're now in Media Composer. As I mentioned before, this is 2023.12. The way that Avid updates the program, they do updates usually about every 3 months, and the version number of the update represents when it was released. So this was released in December of 2023. Okay, so this project window is great for selecting a project, but there's also a cool button in here that a lot of people don't know about, which is there's this little What's New button over here on the left. So if you use Media Composer a lot and you're upgrading from an older version, and you're like, what's new in 2023.12? Or what's new in the 4 versions since the one that I had last? If you click on what's new, it'll actually give you a rundown of all of the new features that have been added in each version. It's actually extremely useful. And it's right here in the project selection window. Okay. So I guess we can just move our media now, which is, okay, so I have, I think I copied it to my desktop. Where is my desktop? Right here. So everyone should have received AEB 2024 media. You should have within there a part 1, a part 2, an Avid user, and an Avid media files folder. So what I want you to do, everyone who's in this class has already done this, but for anyone who is watching this, what you're going to do is if you have an external drive connected, which I do in this case, it won't let me write to this because it's a time machine backup. But what you're going to do is you are going to copy this Avid Media Files folder to the root of your external drive. If you work in Avid a lot and you already have an Avid Media Files folder, then drill down into that folder and grab the 2 and 3 folders and copy them into the MXF folder on the drive that you want that media on. Now, if you don't have an external drive connected, if you're on a Mac, then go ahead and go to the root of your hard drive. So Macintosh HD, go to Users, Shared, Avid Media Composer with no spaces. I don't know why there are 2 of them. And then within here, if you have put anything on your local drive from within Avid, you will have an Avid Media Files folder. If you do not have one, you can just copy this entire Avid Media Files folder into this Avid Media Composer folder. If you do already have an Avid Media Files folder, go into the MXF folder, and copy in the 2 and 3 folders. Now, I believe I've already done it on this system, but you would basically just drag and drop the 2 and 3 into the MXF folder, as I mentioned, either on an external drive or on your internal drive at this path. Now, if it's on an external drive, the folder structure is imperative. If you change the folder structure, Avid will not see the media. If you remove the space after Avid, it will no longer see the media. So you have to have at the root of your drive, if we're talking about an external drive, a folder called Avid Media Files, within that another folder called MXF, and then within that numbered folders. If you're on Windows,
And
all
the
right,
folder structure was this PC, local disk C, users, public documents, Avid Media Composer, which has spaces. I think yours didn't, which was different. But then Avid Media Files, like it normally is with the space and then no space, MXF and numbers.
great, okay. So if you're on Windows, then you'd want to copy those 2 numbered folders into that folder. If
Uh,
you accidentally replace the Avid Media Files folder with the one that came from the Media 2024 folder, as long as you didn't already have important media in your Avid Media Files folder on your local drive, then it's fine. If you did have it, then you just deleted a bunch of media, and I apologize. Okay, so now what I want you to do is, if you didn't before, I want you just so that everybody's looking in the same place, I want you to take the AEB 2024 media folder, the one that has everything in it that you downloaded, and copy it to your desktop. That will just make it easier for everybody to find everything. I already have mine on the desktop, but go ahead and copy it from your downloads folder or wherever to your desktop. So you should have on your desktop, you might not have an Avid Media Files folder in there, but you should have the user folder, part 1, part 2. And that should be on your desktop. Okay, so this is the Media Composer project window. So what we see here is a list of projects in the directory that I have selected. So what I'm seeing right now is projects that are in the folder that I've told Media Composer to look at. You can see within this project window, I have the project name, I have a frame, which I haven't set up, project type, frame rate, color space, all this information about the project. But some of this information I can adjust. So I can increase or decrease the size of these, the columns, and I can also change up the view of the projects, or even choose the columns that I want to show up in here. So these projects are are in this folder. So what I want you guys to do is we're actually going to point it to that folder. So go ahead and hit the browse button, and this will allow us to choose the folder where our projects are. I'm going to go to the desktop. I'm going to choose AEB 2024 media. I'm going to go into part 1, Avid projects, AEB hazard, and then I'm going to hit open. And what I should see is exactly what I saw before, except I'm now pointing it to a different directory, which is 2 projects. I've got the edit project and the assist project. All right, so we'll go into these projects in a second, but first I want to tell you a little bit about how you would create a new project. So if you, right here, we have the projects tab. Alternatively, if you want to create a new project, first of all, you want to make sure that the location that you're in is where you want that project to be created. Because wherever I am located in this dialog right here is where the project will be created. So if I choose a folder here and then I create a new project, it will show up in that folder. So if I go to new project, by default, it's an untitled project. I can call it whatever I want. I'll just leave it as untitled project. So next we have our settings. And you notice that there's a choose for me button. That's something they've added in the last couple of years. And the idea behind that is it's similar to what Resolve does, which basically means when you open the project, it has no format. And it doesn't have any format or resolution until you bring in your first piece of footage. And when you bring that in, it will set your project to match whatever you brought in. Personally, I don't find that necessary, because if you're working on a project, you should know what format you're working in. So usually you'd be working in 2997p. You could be working in 2398 or 23976. Then we have, as far as the things that you really need to be concerned about, color space is definitely not one of them. You will pretty much never change this, except for a few edge cases with exporting ProRes 4444, which you probably won't do anyway. So you can pretty much always leave this as YCBCR 709. I've never worked on a show that is stereoscopic, and I don't think anyone does anymore. You don't have to worry about the search data folder default. But you will see at the bottom that you can actually set up a project here and you can save it as a preset. And then you can actually manage those presets. So for example, if you're constantly creating new episode projects, you don't want to go through and check all the boxes, and you'd rather just have it all set up beforehand, you can save that as a preset. And then whenever you come in here, you can select your preset and then hit OK, and it will load that preset for you. So that is the process of creating a new project. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up this project. Again, this is the project on your desktop in AEB 2024 Media Part 1 Avid Projects AEB Hazard. Right, and I'm going to go into the Assist project. So I'm going to go ahead and select Assist and then hit Open. Okay. All right. So this is my project. This is called AEB Hazard Assist, right? These are all bins. And then within that, I also have folders. So if you've ever worked in Premiere or Final Cut, your project is stored as a project file, which means if you want to get anything from that project, you have to go into Premiere or Final Cut and you have to export it somehow or somehow get it out of that project file. Things are a little different in the world of Media Composer because in Avid, or when you're working with Avid, the projects are actually just folders. So if I go in here and I go into Part 1, Avid Projects, AEB Hazard, you'll see I have two projects in here and they're just folders. So if I go into AEB Hazard Assist, you'll notice that I have in the Finder exactly the same thing that I have in Avid. And the reason for that is that they mirror each other because they're the same thing. So if in the Finder, I trash a folder, when I go back to Avid and save, that folder's gone. If I delete a bin in Avid and I go back to the Finder, that bin has been moved to the trash. So what I'm seeing in Avid is a direct reflection of this folder because this folder is the project. So you might say, well, how does Avid know this is a project? It's just a folder. So the way that Media Composer knows that this is a project is because of this AVP file right here. The AVP file is the project. Let me close this out. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want you to get the point. So if I take this AVP file out, and then I try to go into actually, I can't even go into the project because it doesn't see a project anymore because it no longer sees a folder with the same name as a file within it that's an AVP. So if you want to rename your project at any time, you can do that by simply renaming the AVP file, probably renaming the settings file and renaming the folder. And that will rename your entire project. So anything you do in the project will be reflected in the Finder. And that's super useful because that means that if you want to give somebody a bin, you don't have to export a bin from Media Composer. You just go into the Finder, find the bin, and email it, copy it, do whatever you need to do. You don't even have to open Avid to get that bin out. One of the reasons that Media Composer is so dominant as an NLE is because of something called bin locking. And bin locking basically makes it so that multiple people can work within a single project and can be working within bins and not have to worry about if someone else is going to mess up their work. And the way that that works is if you have two users that are on shared storage, either a Nexus or a third-party shared storage. If one of the users opens up a bin on the Nexus, you can tell this is open because I have this icon right here. Then if another user opens that bin, first of all, the user will see that the bin is locked. Right here, you can see it says that it's locked because it's highlighted and it says who the user is that has that bin open. And that name right there corresponds to the system name. And if I open that bin, you'll see that it is locked. I can play back anything that's in there. I can make changes to it, but they won't be saved. So if I were to make a change to it and I wanted to save it, I would have to save it as a new bin. If you find that there's a bin that is open, but you go to that system and the bin is not actually open, then you have encountered something that we call a ghost lock. The idea behind a ghost lock is Avid will keep the lock on a bin until it is closed. So right here, you'll see that this bin is locked. As soon as I close it, when I go back to this user, if I close it here, you'll see that it's not locked anymore. The way that Avid knows that is because when you open a bin in Media Composer, if you're on shared storage, it will generate, to go with that bin, a file with the same name as the bin, but with a .lck extension. And that .lck file is your lock file. And if you open it up, it will actually list the name of the system that has the lock on the bin. I mentioned before a ghost lock. So if Avid were to crash for some reason, it will not get a chance to remove this .lck file. So you'll notice if I close the bin here in Media Composer and I go back to the project on the Finder level, the LCK is gone because Avid removed it as soon as it saved the bin. But if I have the bin open, you'll see the LCK files there, and Avid crashes. I'm just going to force quit Avid. It never got a chance to remove that LCK file. So if you find that you're working on something and there's a bin that's locked, but the system that has locked it doesn't actually have that bin open, it may be what we call a ghost lock, which means that Avid crashed while it had the bin open, and the person who's been working on that system hasn't reopened the bin since. But if you were to go back into Avid and reopen that bin, as soon as you close the bin, it will remove the lock again. But the alternative is you can actually just remove this LCK file. So this .lck file is the only thing that's telling Avid on this other system that this is a locked bin. If I delete that LCK file and I go back over here, even before I save, it's now unlocked. But keep in mind that this LCK file is very important because if you have an editor that's working on the project, that LCK file is the only thing that's allowing them to continue working on the project. So what I'm trying to get to is you should never mess with an LCK file, a lock file. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have a ghost lock, number one, I would double check that no one else has it open. I mean, it says in the LCK file who has it open. So if that system doesn't have it open, then it's probably nobody. If you've exhausted all options and it's clearly a ghost lock, then you can delete that file. All right, so that is projects. Let's talk a little bit about settings. So I'm going to go up to settings. So that's under file settings. If you're on a Mac, it might be true on Windows. You can also go to Avid Media Composer preferences. It's the same thing. And you'll see that the settings are broken up into 4 panes. So there is the format pane, which is exactly the same pane that you saw when you created the project. There is the project pane, a user pane, and a site pane. Okay. So before I move on to user settings, I want to discuss format a little more. So if you create a project, let's say that you create a project for a show and you're told by your post producer, this show is going to be 2398, it's 1080p, create a project. You create or let's say it's going to be 2997, which is probably, yeah, okay, fine. So it'll be 1080p 2997. So you create a project that's 1080p 2997, and you find out from your post producer, oh, it's not 1080p, it's UHD. You don't have to create a new project. You can easily move between resolutions by just changing the resolution here. So if you switch over to Ultra HD, 2997p, that's all you have to do to change the format of the project. If you want to change the frame rate, that's a whole nother thing. If you want to change the frame rate, you need a new project. But the thing that's nice about that is, let's say you have a ton of work and you need to create a new project. Like, what a headache, right? It's not actually that much of a headache. All you have to do is create the new project. Let's say your new project is the edit project, and then copy all of the media or all of the bins and folders from the assist project into the edit project. And you now have your new project. So I'm going to switch this back. to 2997p, and you can switch your resolution at any time. There's a lot of things that your resolution controls. Number one, it's the resolution that any media you import will come in as. So if you set this to 1080p 2997, then anything you import will come in as 1080p 2997. If you set it to UHD 2997, then anything you import will come in as UHD 2997. It will also determine the resolution of anything that you're playing out to. So if you, for example, this isn't as relevant now with everybody working from home, but if you're working on a show and you're in the office and you have a like a black magic box that you're playing out to, if the box is only set up, let's say it doesn't even do UHD, as soon as you switch away from 1080p to UHD, you will lose picture because the video that your system is now outputting is no longer 1080p. So there are two things that the format controls. Number one, the resolution that you're playing out, and number two, the resolution of anything that you're importing. The UI will not change. So whether I'm looking at 1080p 2997 or UHD 2997, the windows where I look at my footage are not going to be any different. The footage itself might be a little different. So if I zoom in on the footage, I might see more detail. But if I'm looking at it like this, I'm not going to see any change. Okay. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about user settings. So user settings are a specific subset of settings. You'll see that we have 4 different panes here. The second one is project settings. So these are split up by where the settings are stored. So anything under project settings is stored within the project itself. So if you look at, I don't have a Finder window for the project, but if you look at your project directory, part 1, Avid projects, AEB hazard, assist, you'll notice that I have within here a settings file. That settings file and some like I think mostly just that settings file and maybe the background color are the information that is stored within your project settings. So if you were to change something in here and then delete this file and then go back to Avid, that will reset whatever you changed because this is where those settings are stored. With project settings, anyone else who uses this project is also going to have the same settings because the settings are specific to the project settings are. Site settings are settings that are specific to the system that you're on. And those are stored in the applications folder. So if you go to the Avid Media Composer folder in here, let's see, I believe it's settings. Your site settings and site attributes are these settings right here. And those are specific to this system. So if I'm working on multiple systems and I change the site settings on one of the system, it will not show up on the others. And then lastly, we have user settings. And user settings are the settings for a specific user on the system. And the idea behind user settings is that it's convenient to have user settings because you can take them with you. So when you go from one project to another, you can export your user settings and you can bring them with you to another project. Now, Avid is very particular about what you should and should not do as far as importing user settings. They will tell you that you should never import user settings. You should always rebuild them. And if you want to play it extra safe, that's absolutely true. What I will usually do is I will export my user settings and I will import them if I'm moving from an older system to a newer system. So if I'm moving from, let's say that I created my settings in 2018.12 and I'm moving to 2020 point whatever, 2020.4, I will export those settings and import them on 2020.4. And if there are no issues, then I will continue using them. What I would not recommend doing, and in my opinion, what invites corruption, is exporting user settings from newer versions and bringing them to older versions of Media Composer. Because if you think about it, and again, Avid has never officially said this. This is just my experience. But if you think about it, if I export settings from 2022 or 2023.12 and bring them into 2018.12, there's a whole bunch of features in 2023.12 that 2018.12 knows nothing about. And so that discrepancy between the fact that 2018.12 doesn't know anything about 2023.12 invites a lot of potential issues. Whereas if you go from 2018.12 to 2023.12, everything that was it for the most part, everything that was in 2018 is still in 2023 in some form or another. Again, not official. If you want to disagree with me, that's totally fine. That's just my experience. If you wanted to create a new user profile, you can do that from within here. If you want to export your user profile, you can do that by going through this process. I still, to this day, do not understand what any of this means. Shared user profile type. In theory, I thought it meant that the user profile will sync between systems on a shared database, but I've never been able to get that to work. But in general, I just leave it as a personal. Um, and you might get some notifications sometimes that it can't sync. If you do personal, just ignore them. It's fine. So then I would choose a directory where I want to export this. And then let's say to my desktop, and then I'll hit OK. And you'll see that on my desktop, I now have a folder called AEB Assist 2024, which is my user settings for Media Composer. Now, if you ever want to delete a user settings in Media Composer, there is no button to do that. But there is a reveal user profile button, which was added probably a year or two ago, which will allow you to open up the folder that contains all of the user profiles. And from there, you could delete one if you wanted to. But before you do that, make sure you switch to another user profile. Otherwise, Avid will crash on you because it will be trying to read a folder that's no longer there. One more thing is if you're on a project and let's say that you come onto a project where they have very specific export settings, instead of recreating the export settings, what you can actually do is under Windows, there's something called site settings. In site settings, you can actually drag and drop settings from the user settings panel and then switch to another user and drag them back over. So if you are on a project and you're working with somebody who already has settings and you need to bring those over, you don't have to recreate them. As long as their user settings are also on the system, you can bring them over that way. Let's go ahead and import the user settings for this class. So under user profile in your settings window, click import user or user profile. And then I can't do it because I already have the user. Actually, I can just delete it and then bring it in again. Okay, so I will go to, well, I guess I just deleted it while it was in use. So I will go to import user or user profile. I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to go to AEB 2024 media, sorry, and then I'm going to go to Avid user. And I'm going to select AEB Assist 2024 and I'll hit open and it will create the user settings for AEB Assist 2024. So these are the user settings that I created for the class. And I used a specific setup for these user settings. But Avid recently actually made a change to user settings that's very useful, which is if you are someone who enjoys the previous Media Composer user interface, you don't like having everything in one window, you want, like panes across the screen where you can just drag everything wherever you want. If you create a new user, go to create user profile, you'll notice that I have three different options in here. I have Media Composer, which is just going to give me sort of the vanilla Media Composer look. I have Media Composer Classic, which is supposed to emulate 2018.12 and earlier. And then I have transitioning from Premiere Pro, which I've never used. But I'd be curious to know anyone who uses Premiere, what your thoughts are on it. But if I go to Classic, and I'll just create a test user called test. Oh, I already have a user called test. So I guess I have a lot of users. Let me create another one. I'll call it 2018 and I'll hit OK. So you'll notice that when I do that, everything changes back to how it was in 2018. So you'll see here my project window is now includes my effects palette and my settings, just like it did in 2018. And all of my windows are, or all of my panes are individual windows now that I can drag around however I'd like. So if you're hating the new version of Avid because you've lost the ability to work the way that you did before, this would be the answer. Personally, I'm fine with the new interface, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back to Assist 2024. And then let's quickly go over some of the settings. Okay, so what I would look at is your bin settings, which includes settings for the attic. The Avid attic is basically a folder that Avid creates at the root of whatever drive the project is on. It doesn't look like it's created it on my system. But the idea behind the attic is that at a certain interval, Avid will always generate a backup of all of the bins that you're using. So if you work on something for several hours, and then Avid crashes on you, then you can go into the attic and you can look. Actually, I have another system that I can reference for this. Here. So this is a system that has a Nexus, which we'll be talking about a little later. And you'll see here that there's something called the Unity Attic. And this has a folder for every project on the drive. So within this folder, you'll see that I have bins, and each bin is represented by a folder. And within there, I have files with numbers after them that indicate in what order they were generated. So if I'm working in Avid, for example, and it crashes on me, then what I would want to do is I'd want to go to the root of the project drive, and I would want to go into the Unity Attic, find my project, go into bins, find the bin that I was working in, and then look for the highest numbered file. And you should be able to look at the created and modified time on that bin, and that should tell you where in the process that bin was created. So if I crashed at 4:30 p.m. and this bin was modified at 3:55, there's a good chance that most of my work is in this bin. And what I would do in that case is I would copy the bin and I would paste it on my, I mean, you can paste it anywhere, but I usually paste it on my desktop, and then change the file extension from a number to .avb, use avb, and then open that up in Media Composer and check to see if it has my changes. Now, if it does have my changes, then keep in mind that the bin that you're working out of, if you start working out of that bin, is on your desktop. So if you want that to be your new master bin, then you have to close the bin out and then replace the one that's actually in the project. If you're not using an external drive, then it will be in the same place where your Avid Media was, which is in users, shared, Avid Media Composer, and then Avid Attic. Yeah. So these are all the projects. So this is the Assist project. This is the one I'm in now. And you can see that if I sort by date modified, My most recently modified bin was yesterday at 4:29 p.m. I can go in there, I can grab whichever one I want, copy it to my wherever, desktop, whatever, change the file extension to AVB, and then check to see if my work is in there. Okay, so within here we have all kinds of options regarding the attic. And then there are a bunch of other settings that I would strongly recommend you look through in here. The things that I would take a look at are number one, default bin view, which we'll be talking about later. Your maximum number of files in the attic. Sometimes you have to go through and clean out the attic because attics can get really unwieldy if nobody's cleaning them out. Um, and then one that I really like that no one uses is this one right here, which says show local media icons. So if you're on local storage, you'll notice that every clip you click on is just a gray box. That's in contrast to if you're on shared storage, where every clip has an icon that represents that it's online. And if the media goes offline, then the clip changes to represent that it's offline. If you don't check this box, then there's no way to easily tell if media is offline if you're not working in shared storage. So I would strongly recommend checking it. And you'll notice that every clip, once you check that box, every clip in your bin will have a little blue line on it indicating that it's online. And then there's also skip prompts to save locked bins on autosave. I'd recommend doing that because it's really annoying to constantly get errors saying that the bin that you have open is locked and whether you'd like to save it as a new copy or whatever, close it. Um, and there's other stuff in here that's useful, but those are the things that I would probably recommend taking a look at. All right, so that's bin. I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff and go to Composer. Um, Composer is something you'll want to look at. I don't usually change much in here. But everything in here is useful to just take a look at, specifically the edit and window tabs. I would also look at interface. Interface is a big one. So interface allows you to do all kinds of fun stuff as far as changing what the interface looks like. It won't be updated until you hit apply. So if you change it to a white outline, when you hit apply or maybe okay, yeah, it will update. Um, that ugly brown color, I'll hit apply on this again. So when I hit okay, so you can change all kinds of stuff about what the interface looks like. You can make it look like the old Avid with the bright colors. Ugh, that's horrible. I'm gonna go back to the dark color, hit apply. One thing that I would recommend changing in here with this version of Avid is when moving to a workspace, make sure that it's set to load last saved state. Because I'll talk about workspaces in a minute, but this can be a real headache if you have it set to load last known state, and I believe that's what it defaults to. There's all kinds of settings for your bins. Uh, One thing that can be useful is to override bin fonts. So if you get a bin that's some kind of weird serify, like, Webding's font, then it will just ignore whatever the font is and it will replace it with whatever you tell it to do. Then we'll talk about keyboard in a minute. Timeline I would look at. So is there anything in here that I would change? I've already changed these because this is a custom user setting already. But the things that I would normally go in and change when I create a new user, under the edit tab, go to your start filler duration and make sure it's set to 10 seconds. Because for some reason on the user as it was before, it was like a weird nonsensical number. So go ahead and make sure that's set to 10 seconds. Everything else in here, for the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about. But as I maybe said, um, all of the all of the settings in here can be very useful. You just want to read up on what they do and when you can use them. We also have keyboard, which I will quickly cover. So your keyboard settings um, are basically what every key on the keyboard does. And you can change that with if you open up the keyboard here and then you go up to Tools and choose Command Palette, you'll get this window right here. The whole idea behind the Command Palette is that you can replace the keys on your keyboard. So the way that you would do that is you would just figure out what you want to do, find the key for it, or you can search the key for it. That was added last year, I think. So if I want trim, type that in, and anything that says trim in the name is going to show up. Um, and then I can just drag and drop these keys onto my keys down here, and they'll show up as keys on my keyboard. Now, alternatively, let's say that I want to do something that is not in this command palette. Like for example, for me, I have Shift X set to export to file, but that is not in this command palette. So what I would do to set Shift X to export to file is I would go to menu to button reassignment. I would click on the button that I want to reassign. So in this case, I'd hold down Shift and I'd click on X, and then I'd go up to File. I would find the command, and then I would click on it. I'll go Output, Export to File, and you'll see that it now sets, I mean, it was before, but it sets that key on the keyboard to the command that you chose in the menu. So that's menu to button reassignment. And then the last one, which I don't know of anyone who actually uses this, is called active palette. The idea behind active palette is that when you select active palette, everything in here becomes a button. So if you click mark in, that will set a mark in on your timeline. So active palette makes everything in here a button. Okay, so that's your keyboard settings. You can have as many keyboard settings as you want. You can name them different things. So I can duplicate this keyboard, and then I can call the new one like, grouping or whatever. And then I can change it however I want, and I can switch over to it at any time. So that is keyboard settings. So now let's talk a little bit about the user interface. So this user interface is significantly different from the user interface of the older versions of Media Composer. The idea behind the new interface is that everything is now contained within a single window in the interface. So that single window will contain panes for all of the different what used to be windows in Media Composer. And the way that it works is you can actually drag these out and either let go of them so that they become their own windows or drop them somewhere. And you'll see these green tabs. Those indicate places where you can drop this. And you'll notice that when I drag this over an area, it will outline in white, telling me that the window is going to go there. So for example, if I wanted to put it over here so that it goes back to where it was before and I split the top pane with bins, then all I have to do is drag and drop it and it'll end up there. Now, but what about if I wanted to have like more than one thing in a window? So for example, if I wanted to, for some reason, recreate the way that it was in Media Composer 2018, where I had the effect palette down here, then what I can do is I can open up the effect palette. So you'll notice if I try to drag and drop it, by default, it will try to split the pane between all the stuff that's already there. I don't want that. So what I can do instead is if I hold Option and drag it, you'll see that it now allows me to drop it as a tab into any other window. And I can move it around so that Effect Palette is the bottom tab, or I can leave it as the top tab. If you have multiple monitors, one of the monitors is always set as the main monitor. You can tell Media Composer which monitor should be the main one by going to your host panel. If you go to host panels, your main monitor should be set to the system that you want to use. Does anybody have any more questions about the interface?
Are these saved under the user settings? So when I
Yeah,
move,
everything
they
you
come
do
with
in
me?
here is saved under user settings.
Okay, cool.
Let's say that I want multiple what are called workspaces. So let's say sometimes I want my bins like over here with like the effect editor. I don't know. Let's say sometimes I want the effect palette here. So I can actually save this as a workspace by going up to Windows and then go to workspaces and I'll do new workspace. If I do save current, it will save over edit. So I'll do new workspace. I'll call it effects personal. Okay. And then when I hit OK, now I can switch over to any other workspace. Keeps going to my other monitor. And then when I go to effects personal, it switches back to what I saved. Now, if I change anything within effects personal, let's say I drag this out because I want to look at something and then I move this over. And then I decide that I want to go back to how it was saved. Whatever, I don't care. Then I can just go up to Windows, Workspaces, and then I can do Restore to Saved. Or if I want, let's say that I make a change to Effects Personal, and then I switch away to Edit. It goes to this monitor, and then I go back to Effects Personal. It should go back to the way that it was saved. And that's because of the setting that I mentioned before. Under Settings, General. Yeah, so when moving to a workspace, I have it set to load last saved state. Alternatively, you could have it set to load last known state. And basically what that would do is if I set it that way, then if I make any changes to the workspace and then I switch to another workspace, when I come back to my workspace from before, it will not go back to my saved state. It'll go back to whatever I had when I last opened it. Personally, I don't like that because sometimes I'll go through and make changes and then usually they're just temporary changes. And so I usually just want to go back to the saved state. So I have that set to load last saved state. All right, and then I'll hit OK. Okay, one more thing in workspaces is that you can actually link settings to workspaces. So for example, if you, let's see, if you wanted to, I have effects personal, let's say that every time I switch over to effects personal, I want to switch my keyboard too. So what I can do is if I go down here under workspace view and I select effects personal, I can choose link to named settings. I have to think about this a little beforehand, but let's say I name everything that I want to switch over to as personal. So what I would type in here is personal, and then every time I switch over to effects personal, any setting that is called personal, it'll switch over to. So it's really useful because it allows me to easily switch between workspaces and have other settings follow along. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the bin container. So this is something that's a little different in this version of Media Composer. It used to be that we had a project window, and technically the project window still exists, but it's mostly pointless. It's mostly there for people who want to recreate what Media Composer 2018 was. So you can pull up a project window, but it's just a sort of a neutered version of the uh, bin container, which is right here. So the idea behind a bin container is that it's a combination of what used to be the project window and a bin. And you can have multiple bin containers, but I'll get to that in a second. So you'll notice that if I double click on this bin, it opens up in the right side of my bin container. Let's say that I'm working and I don't care about my project right now because I'm deep in a cut and I'll worry about the project when I go to save. I can actually hide the project altogether by just dragging this over to the left. So I now have just the bin by itself. So if you ever see a bin by itself, with no project on the left, all you have to do is drag to the right and you'll end up, or it'll show up with a project. So if I do new bin container, you'll see that I get the exact same thing. And one thing that's kind of nice about this is that you can actually organize your bins by what they are. So you could have, let's say you have a bunch of B-roll bins. You could, let's say that they're all, and oh, by the way, I don't know why, this is kind of ridiculous, but if you ever, let me close this out. If you ever have a bin that you want to drag out, you have to release it somewhere that has a green tab. Otherwise, it will do nothing. So if I drag it out over here and release, it won't do anything. But if I drag it out over here where there's a green tab, it will actually pull it out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Let's say that I drag this out. What I was saying about bin containers is that it's kind of nice because you could have, let's say, a bin container for, footage from day 1, and then a bin container for footage from day 2. And you can actually have them both in the same window. And you can switch between them, and you can actually rename them as well. So you can set a bin container like day 1. And then day 2. And then you can have within there all of the bins for day 1 or day 2 or whatever. Right? So I have a bin container here for, whatever I have for that day. And then I have a bin container over here for anything from day 2. And if you, let's say that you have a bin that's just floating around and you want to integrate it into an existing bin container, if you, I believe, grab the top and then hold Option, you can drag and drop it and it will become part of that set of bins. Alternatively, if you want to tab it on the left, if you drag this right here and drop it here, then it will tab on the left. There's obviously a lot more to Media Composer than what I've covered, but I've sort of pared it down to what I feel is the most important things to cover. That's pretty much it for the overview of the interface. We'll be talking a little bit more about what everything is within the interface, but as far as the rundown of how to use everything in the UI and actually, I didn't mention over here, we have our workspace bar. So I talked about workspaces. All of your workspaces will show up here and you can switch between them by just clicking right here. So this will switch you to edit. This will switch you to effects. You can also hide that, I believe, by going to hide workspace bar. And now it just becomes this tiny little thing at the top. I think that's pretty much it.
Quick question on bin containers.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand, like, number one, are they a file that relates to a folder? You know how the bins relate to the AVB, to the containers also? Is that just part of the
No,
interface? And
that's just
then,
part of the interface.
okay, and then, so how do you add more bins to that particular interface versus the other one, the original? If you have 2 bin containers, you know what I mean? Like you did day 1 and day 2, and you open
It
up.
just depends on where you open them. So by default, they will open in whatever bin container you double click on them from. So if I double click on a bin here in day 2, it will open up in day 2. If I double click on a bin in day 1, it will open up in day 1.
Oh, what's weird is when I double click on day 2, it opens up in day 1. It switches the container to day 1 for
Well,
me.
the only time that will happen is if you have a bin already open in bin.
Ah,
So
yeah,
right now I have practice open in day 1. If I double click on that in day 2, it'll
it'll take you
put
to
it
day
in day
1.
1.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I guess kind of just to piggyback off of that, if this is going to get saved anywhere, that would be like a user settings thing, right? Because this is layout of like
All
the
of this
program.
is user settings.
Okay.
Your workspaces, everything that we've been covering is user settings.